began not with a scream but with a quiet walk. January 15th, 1947. A mother, Betty Bersinger, was pushing her young daughter in a stroller through the sparse, undeveloped neighborhood of Leimert Park, Los Angeles. In a vacant lot overgrown with weeds, she saw something white. At first glance, she thought it was a discarded store mannequin, broken in half. As she moved closer, the illusion shattered and a cold, primal horror took its place. This was not a mannequin. It was the body of a young woman severed at the waist, her blood completely drained, her face carved into a terrifying, permanent grin. This was the discovery. But the case began days later, when the press, in a frenzy of sensationalism, gave her a name. It wasn't her name. It was a nickname borrowed from a popular film noir. A name that would eclipse her entire identity and launch America's most infamous unsolved crime, the Black Dahlia. The victim was identified as Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress from Massachusetts. In life, she was one of thousands of young women who flocked to post-war Hollywood, a dreamer with no money, no connections, and no real prospects. She was, in the cold language of the city, a nobody. And that is the central terrifying paradox of this case. How does a person who was functionally anonymous in life become, in death, the most famous murder victim in American history? How does her name become a permanent dark fixture in Hollywood lore, while the person, Elizabeth Short, remains a ghost, a blank canvas onto which an entire city projected its darkest fears and fantasies? This was not just a murder. It was a ritual. It was a spectacle. And it was a warning. Today we are not just investigating a cold case. We are dissecting a myth. Who was the real Elizabeth Short? And what dark forces in 1940s Los Angeles, a city rotting with corruption beneath its glamorous surface, conspired not just to end her life, but to create the horrifying public spectacle known as the Black Dahlia?
To understand the myth, we must first rescue the person. Before she was the Dahlia, she was simply Beth. Elizabeth Short was born in 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts, into a world far removed from the Klieg lights of Hollywood. Her childhood was defined by two profound traumas: abandonment and illness. When she was just 5 years old, her father, Cleo Short, parked his car on a bridge and vanished. The family assumed he had taken his own life, a victim of the 1929 stock market crash. He left his wife, Phoebe, to raise 5 daughters alone in abject poverty. Elizabeth, the third of the 5, grew up resourceful, but also deeply affected by the absence of a father and the constant struggle for money. Then came the illness. As a teenager, she developed severe asthma, her lungs struggling against the cold, damp New England air. This illness would, ironically, dictate the entire course of her short life. Doctors recommended a warmer climate, and at 16, she was sent to spend winters in Florida, living with family friends. This began a pattern that would define her existence. She became a drifter, not out of a wild, rebellious spirit, but out of necessity. She was perpetually moving, a guest in other people's homes, a young woman with no permanent address and no anchor. Her one true passion was the cinema. Like so many of her generation, she saw Hollywood as an escape, a fantasy land where a poor girl could become a star. She idolized the actresses on the silver screen. In 1942, a letter arrived that changed everything. Her dead father, Cleo, was alive. He had faked his suicide and was living in Vallejo, California. At 18, Beth packed her bags, her dreams, and her persistent cough, and moved west to live with the man who had abandoned her. The reunion was a disaster. Cleo was a stern disciplinarian, and Elizabeth was a young woman who had raised herself. She lasted only a few months before he kicked her out. This was the moment she was truly set adrift. She was now in California, the land of her dreams, but she was utterly alone and penniless. She drifted south to Santa Barbara, where she was arrested for underage drinking and promptly shipped back to Massachusetts by the police. But she had tasted the California air. She would return. For the next few years, she bounced between Massachusetts and Florida, working low-wage waitress jobs, dating servicemen, and always dreaming of Hollywood. Those who knew her during this time described her not as the dark, mysterious femme fatale the papers would later create, but as something far more tragic: a lost girl. She was pretty, vivacious, and quick to laugh, but there was a deep-seated naivete and a desperation to her. She was, according to one acquaintance, always looking for someone to take care of her. She was known for her all-black clothing, a cheap wool suit and a tailored coat, not as a fashion statement, but because it was likely the only respectable outfit she owned. She was a young woman trying to project an image of glamour while existing on the absolute fringes of society, often broke, sometimes hungry, and pathologically vulnerable. This vulnerability would, in the end, be the only thing that mattered. Because the killer was never found, we cannot analyze his personal trigger. We cannot point to a lost job, a failed marriage, or a moment of psychological collapse. But we can, and we must, analyze the environment that acted as a trigger. The Los Angeles of 1947 was not the sunny, optimistic dream factory portrayed in the movies. It was a powder keg. It was a post-war city choking on its own growth, flooded with hundreds of thousands of returning servicemen, many of whom were deeply traumatized by the horrors they had seen, a condition we now call PTSD. It was a city of transience, a place where people came to reinvent themselves, or to disappear entirely, and disappearing was easy, because the city was rotting from the inside out. The LAPD of the 1940s was notoriously, systemically corrupt. It was a brutal, racist, and often incompetent organization, more interested in protecting the interests of Hollywood moguls and mobsters than in solving the murders of nobodies. This was the hunting ground, a chaotic, anonymous, and cynical city where a killer could operate with perceived impunity. Into this environment walked the perfect victim. In late 1946, Elizabeth Short arrived back in Los Angeles, this time for good. She was 22, still dreaming of fame, but her reality was grim. She was one of the shadow girls of Hollywood, drifting from one cheap rooming house to another, surviving on the kindness of strangers, waitressing for a few days here, dating a man for a free meal there. This lifestyle, born of poverty, made her the ideal target. She had no safety net. No one would notice she was missing for days, maybe weeks. Now, let's trace her final, fatal week. On January 9, 1947, she was last seen alive by Robert "Red" Manley, a married salesman she had been dating. He had picked her up in San Diego and driven her to Los Angeles. She told him she was going to meet her sister. A lie. He dropped her off at the opulent Biltmore Hotel downtown. She was seen by hotel staff, seemingly making phone calls in the lobby, and then she vanished. She walked out of the Biltmore's grand entrance and into an abyss. What happened between January 9th and January 15th is the dark heart of this mystery. She was not killed on the 15th. The autopsy would later prove she had been held captive, bound, and systematically tortured for at least 3 days before her death. The trigger, then, was not a sudden, passionate event. It was the moment a predator, who likely had a long-held and deeply sadistic fantasy, crossed paths with the most vulnerable person in the city. The trigger was the opportunity. The killer wasn't enraged by Elizabeth. He was empowered by her helplessness. He had found the perfect, anonymous canvas on which to paint his masterpiece of cruelty. And he knew that in the chaos of 1947 Los Angeles, he would likely get away with it.
When Betty Bersinger discovered the body on January 15th, the LAPD arrived at a scene that was unlike anything they had ever encountered. This was not a typical homicide. This was a statement. The body of Elizabeth Short had been subjected to a horrifying, meticulous ritual. First, it was bisected with surgical precision, a hemicorporectomy, severing the body at the waist. She had been completely drained of blood, and her entire body had been scrubbed clean. There was not a single drop of blood at the scene, proving she had been killed and dismembered elsewhere, then transported to the vacant lot. The killer's work was deeply personal. Her body was covered in lacerations and ligature marks, indicating she had been bound and tortured for days. But the most grotesque mutilation was reserved for her face. The killer had used a knife to carve a Glasgow smile, slicing her mouth open from ear to ear, creating a horrifying Joker-like grin. And then he had posed her. Her upper torso was placed a foot away from her lower half, her arms raised above her head, her legs spread. This was not a dump job, This was a presentation. This was art, in the mind of a psychopath. The autopsy would later confirm the procedural nature of the crime. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and the resulting shock from her extensive injuries. Many of the most severe mutilations, including the bisection, were performed after she was already dead. This detail is crucial. It points away from a frenzied, passionate killer and towards a cold, methodical, and possibly medically trained individual who was fulfilling a long-rehearsed fantasy. He had tortured her, killed her, and then worked on her body like a surgeon or a sculptor. But the killer's performance was only half the show. The other half was provided by the Los Angeles press. The city's newspapers, particularly William Randolph Hearst's Los Angeles Examiner and the Herald Express, descended on the story like vultures. This was the perfect sensationalist fodder, a cocktail of sex, horror, and Hollywood. It was the Examiner that, in a flash of dark brilliance, officially nicknamed her the Black Dahlia, a name likely born from the 1946 film noir The Blue Dahlia and Elizabeth's rumored preference for black clothing. The moment that name was printed, Elizabeth Short ceased to exist. She was replaced by a character, a mysterious, seductive, dark-clad femme fatale. The press published doctored photos of her, fabricated stories about her love life, and painted a portrait of a promiscuous, easy girl who was asking for it. This narrative transformed the city's terror into a twisted form of entertainment. The Mad Butcher, as the killer was also known, was on the loose, and the Black Dahlia was the story of the decade. This citywide hysteria and media circus was precisely what the killer wanted. He had not only committed a murder, he had created a legend, with the press as his willing co-author. The investigation into the Black Dahlia's murder was at the time the largest in LAPD history. Hundreds of officers, detectives, and even veterans from military intelligence were thrown at the case. But from the very beginning, the investigation was doomed, not by a lack of manpower, but by a catastrophic contamination of evidence, ethics, and procedure, fueled entirely by the press. The media circus didn't just report on the case. It actively interfered with it. Rival newspapers would receive anonymous tips and withhold them from the police trying to break the case themselves. They trampled crime scenes, hounded witnesses, and published wild, unverified rumors as front-page news. Then, 9 days after the body was found, the killer himself joined the conversation. On January 24th, the Los Angeles Examiner received a package. Inside was a collection of Elizabeth Short's personal belongings, her birth certificate, her social security card, photographs, and an address book. The entire package had been meticulously cleaned with gasoline, erasing any possible fingerprints. The killer was now taunting them, proving he had her possessions and was smart enough to leave no trace. This was his first letter. More would follow. The killer, or someone claiming to be him, began sending cut-and-paste letters to the press using words clipped from newspapers, a tactic that would later be echoed by the Zodiac. One read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings," followed by "I will give up. And then just days later, "I have changed my mind." This was a game. The killer was reveling in the panic he had created, treating the LAPD and the media as his puppets. The investigation devolved into chaos. In the absence of real evidence, the police and the press turned on the victim herself, manufacturing a narrative that she knew hundreds of men, that she was a barfly and a teaser. This led to a tidal wave of false leads and confessions. Over 60 people, mostly men, would confess to the murder over the years, all of them dismissed as publicity seekers or mentally unstable. The list of real suspects became a who's who of 1940s Los Angeles. Robert "Red" Manley, the last man to see her alive, was an early favorite until he passed multiple polygraph tests. The list grew to include Hollywood figures, doctors, and small-time criminals. But in recent decades, one suspect has emerged as the most compelling and terrifying: Dr. George Hodel. Hodel was a brilliant and respected physician, a specialist in venereal diseases who ran a clinic in Los Angeles. He was also a man with a dark side. He was a known philanderer, held decadent, drug-fueled parties, and was a prime suspect in the incestuous abuse of his own daughter, Tamar. But the most chilling theory, proposed by his own son, former LAPD detective Steve Hodel, connects him to the case. Dr. Hodel was a surgical genius, possessing the exact skills needed to perform the bisection. He was also a member of the Surrealist art scene, friends with the artist Man Ray. This connection, as we will see, is a terrifying academic twist. But at the time, the investigation went nowhere. The files grew thicker, the leads grew colder. The LAPD, overwhelmed, corrupt, and embarrassed, quietly shelved the case. The Black Dahlia became the department's greatest, most public failure. Justice was not just delayed. It was never even a remote possibility. The killer was never found, but his victim was lost twice. First, her life was stolen in that unknown dark room. And second, her identity was stolen by the very people who claimed to be telling her story. The real Beth Short, the asthmatic, movie-loving, naive girl from Massachusetts, was completely and permanently erased. In her place, the press created the Black Dahlia, a one-dimensional caricature, a dark-clad, seductive siren whose mysterious lifestyle, they insinuated, was the real cause of her demise. This grotesque myth-making served a dark purpose. It subtly blamed the victim. It was a comfortable lie that allowed the public to believe that things like this didn't happen to good girls, was a lie that protected the city's glamorous image by sacrificing the reputation of a dead woman. The true victims, the ones left to navigate this nightmare, were Elizabeth's family. Her mother, Phoebe Short, living back in Massachusetts, was subjected to an act of journalistic cruelty that is almost unbelievable today. Reporters from the Examiner called her, claiming that her daughter Beth had won a beauty contest. For 30 minutes they pumped the grieving, hopeful mother for every personal detail, every quote, every piece of background information. Only after they had drained her of information did they deliver the final brutal blow, that her daughter was in fact dead and the subject of the most gruesome murder in the city's history. Phoebe and her 4 other daughters had to live the rest of their lives knowing that their sister and daughter wasn't remembered as a person, but as a grisly, unsolved puzzle, a piece of public property. The city of Los Angeles itself became a victim. The Black Dahlia case became a permanent scar on its psyche, the moment the post-war Hollywood dream curdled into a nightmare. It exposed the rot of corruption at the heart of the LAPD and the predatory, amoral nature of its media. The case came to symbolize the death of innocence for an entire generation. But the final, most profound tragedy remains with Elizabeth. The media's narrative stripped her of her humanity. She was not a femme fatale. She was not a teaser who asked for it. She was a poor, vulnerable, and often lonely young woman who was systematically preyed upon. She was a victim of a system that offered her dreams but no safety net, and of a press that, in the end, was as ghoulish as her killer, picking apart her reputation just as he had picked apart her body. Rescuing her story means rejecting the myth and acknowledging the brutal, simple truth. She was a victim, not a character.
For over 75 years, the question has always been, who did it? Was it a random, sadistic drifter? Or was it someone powerful, like Dr. George Hodel? The debate has been endless, but the more terrifying question, and the one that provides the academic twist, is not who, but why. Why the staging? Why the bisection? Why the Glasgow smile? This is where the theory proposed by Steve Hodel becomes so compelling. His father, Dr. George Hodel, was not just a surgeon. He was a prominent member of the Los Angeles Surrealist art scene. He was friends with the famous artist Man Ray. One of Man Ray's most famous photographs is called The Minotaur. It depicts the upper torso of a woman, her arms raised above her head, posed almost identically to the upper half of Elizabeth Short's body. Another of his works, The Lovers, depicts 2 faces shrouded in cloth, their lips locked in a kiss, but their features obscured, an image hauntingly similar to the Glasgow smile, a mouth that can no longer speak. The academic twist is this. The Black Dahlia murder was not a crime of passion. It was a work of art. It was a deliberate, horrifying act of surrealist art, performed by a killer who saw himself not as a mere murderer, but as a dark auteur. This theory reframes everything. The bisection wasn't just for transport. It was a direct homage to the Minotaur. The Glasgow smile was an artistic flourish. The staging in the vacant lot was the gallery exhibition for his masterpiece. This killer wasn't a frenzied maniac. He was a brilliant, meticulous, and artistically driven sadist who wanted to shock the world with his creation. This theory, that the killer was an artist, is the only one that adequately explains the cold, procedural, and highly ritualistic nature of the crime. This case, then, becomes a dark parable, a chilling takeaway that resonates to this day. It is not just an unsolved murder. It is a cultural Rorschach test. It's a story about the devastating dangers of the Hollywood dream and the real human cost of fame-seeking in a city that manufactures and destroys icons with equal enthusiasm. It is a profound lesson in the power of the media. The press didn't just report on the Black Dahlia. They created her, proving that a sensational narrative, no matter how false, can be more powerful and enduring than the truth. But ultimately, the Black Dahlia's story is a terrifying warning about vulnerability and how society treats its most disposable victims. The killer erased Elizabeth Short's body, and the press erased her identity. Both acted with impunity. The killer was never found, but the myth he authored became his true, lasting legacy. The Black Dahlia is no longer just a person. She is a symbol, a permanent, dark stain on the soul of Los Angeles, and a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who hide in plain sight, wearing the masks of brilliance, power, and respectability.